بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم. So Alhamdulillah, we are continuing now with Sūrah al-Mumtaḥana. This is the second session. And if we remember when we started the second juz, Shaykh Amin, he told us that there's a unifying theme for this juz, for this juz of the Quran. And he said it was Jamr, or we can also say Hashar, which is to bring things together, bring entities together, bring personalities together, bring groups together. And we saw that in Surah Mujadilah, in various ayat that repeated throughout the surah. And towards the end of the surah, we saw that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala categorized people into two groups. One was Hizbullah and the other was Hizbul Shaitan. The party of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the group of Allah, and the group of Shaitan. So you have this form of Jamr, this form of Hashr that's happening, where people are corralled together and they are grouped together into various groups. Then we saw the same thing in Surah al-Hashr, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala towards the beginning of the surah talks about لِأَوَّلِ الْحَشْرِ, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He corralled the Jews of Banu Nadir together, and then He collectively had them exiled from Medina. And then as Surah Al-Hashr continued, we saw that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke about distinct groups, one group being that of the believers, and the other group being that of the hypocrites and the disbelievers, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grouped the hypocrites and the disbelievers together. So they're being grouped together in this dunya, even though, or in the surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala groups them together in the surah, even though in this dunya, they may at times, you may say, well, they're distinct groups. So the answer to that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala groups them together in the surah based on what their end result in the akhirah is going to be. Right? Whether they're going to have salvation or not. So what we saw in Surah Mujadilah is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, based on people's salvation, there are only two groups. There is Hizbullah and Hizbul Shaitan. And then in Surah Al-Hashr, He tells us that even though the Jews, they may proclaim faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but because they don't believe in the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this is the first Hashr. This is what's happening to them in the dunya. They've been corralled together and exiled from the midst of the Muslims because they are not those that submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what's happening in the dunya is representative of what will happen in the akhirah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring people together, not based on their social features, not based on their racial features, not based on any other feature, but their theological inclinations. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala towards the end of Surah Al-Hashr, He puts all of the disbelievers, whether they're hypocrites or vocally and self-proclaimed disbelievers, He puts them all together in one group because theologically in the akhirah, they are going to be in one group. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He starts Sūrah al-Mumtaḥana, and in Sūrah al-Mumtaḥana, the theme of Sūrah al-Mumtaḥana that Shaykh Amin very emphatically stressed today is pride in the Ummah. Because this is the group that you belong to. And you should have pride in this group because this is the group that will have salvation in the Akhirah. So this surah is directed towards the believers and ask the believers to be very vocal and upfront about where their loyalties lie, and to not be like the hypocrites. Because in Surah al-Hashr, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He discussed the hypocrites. And over here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the believers, don't be like the hypocrites. Because your ultimate end in the akhirah is different. Therefore, you should also be different in this world. Okay? So that's why today we saw that in the model that was given to us, the model of Ibrahim alayhi salam and his community of believers that was around him, was that they made a statement, "Inna bura'a'u minkum wa mimma ta'buduna min dunillah kafarna bikum," that we are completely free and we are completely disassociated from you and that which you worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have separated ourselves from you. Okay? So when something is part of our aqidah, then we must be very clear in expressing it. And there is no room for compromise there. So where in civil values and other values as citizens living together in a community or a society, we may develop and we may compromise on norms so that we can live together peacefully. But as a statement of our theology, we can never compromise our aqidah. We must state that we do not believe that you and us will enjoy the same fate in the akhirah. We must state that we are different. Sheikh Amin also pointed to this, to how there is a trend, and unfortunately a growing trend, of people that want to compromise on aqidah. Okay? And these people can be found within the common masses, but really it starts from the academic elite who push these ideas. And often when you take an appraisal of these academic elites, as Sheikh Amin, he mentioned, a lot of times Sheikh Amin mentions things and he's kind of speaking in, he's alluding to things without clearly stating them. Right? So we'll go ahead and we'll stay with that method for now, inshallah, where you have Muslims that are actually pushing this agenda that it's okay, wal'iyadu billah, right? And we cannot say for sure that someone passes away without believing in the Prophet ﷺ, whether they will have salvation or not. So theologically, that's making a compromise that has no basis in the deen. It's completely false. That's a heretical statement. Statements such as, can we really damn someone to hell just because they didn't believe in Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Just because they didn't believe in the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Just? Is that a word that a Muslim uses regarding faith about Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? That's a statement that betrays, lack of loyalty. Right? Where in the beginning of Sūrah al-Mumtaḥana, وَقَدْ كَفَرُوا بِمَا جَاءَكُم مِّنَ الْحَقِّ يُخْرِجُونَ الرَّسُولَ وَإِيَّاكُمْ. They have disbelieved in what has come to you from the truth. So it's not like, they're all okay as long as you believe in one God. No, وَقَدْ كَفَرُوا بِمَا جَاءَكُم مِّنَ الْحَقِّ. Allah uses the word kufr. And when a person doesn't believe in what has come to the Rasul, that is kufr. So there's no room of compromising there. Okay? So it's important that we very clearly state that no, we are not going to make any compromises regarding our aqidah. Okay? And then إِنَّا بُرَآءُ مِنْكُمْ مِمَّا تَعْبُدُونَ مِنْ دُونِ اللَّهِ كَفَرْنَا بِكُمْ وَبَدَا بَيْنَنَا وَبَيْنَكُمُ الْعَدَاوَةُ. Okay? So after a statement, that statement must be reflective of a person's inner state. It cannot be empty words. Okay? So today we see plenty of empty words where people criticize and they denounce, certain actions of certain states and whatnot, but internally they're void of actually having those emotions. That is a form of nifaq. That is a form of hypocrisy. And if you remember in Surah Mujadila, we spoke about that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what you hide, even if you say something, but internally you have something else. Right? The whole concept of najwa, right, that we have spoken about. Okay? So to simply make a statement that we are different from you is not the same as also internally feeling hate towards that belief. Okay? So in today's hypersensitive culture, right, it's almost taboo to use the word hate. But there are instances where hate is recommended, and it is something that is instinctive, human. Right? It's very human to feel the emotion of hate. Right? So our deen does not deprive us of feeling human emotions. What it does is it gives us the right outlet for those emotions. So the right outlet for the emotion of hate is towards the disbelief of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? Now, oftentimes we hear this statement that we don't hate the person, we hate the crime. Okay? So there is a valid interpretation of that statement, that yes, our hate is not personal. Okay? And what is the proof of our hate of a disbeliever not being personal? Is that if that same person believes, then we immediately love them, as is stated in the ayah, hatta tu'minu, until you believe. Once you believe, immediately and instantly the animosity that was there drops. Okay? So the hate is not directed towards the individual, it is directed towards the disbelief. Once the individual is disassociated from disbelief, then we no longer have any hate towards them. Okay? Now, the invalid way of saying it is that, okay, well, then we're not going to we don't hold any hate towards any non-believer or towards any disbeliever. As long as the disbelief is with them, you can't separate between the two, because it's the person. The person has the disbelief. So as long as that person is characterized by disbelief, then yes, that is going to be the direction of our hate. Right? Now remember, the direction of our hate, that is something that is internal. It does not manifest in a illegal form that Islam has deemed illegal, such as burning down places of worship or harming property. Right? We don't do that, because the same Allah that told us to internally feel hate towards disbelief is the same Allah that tells us, do not harm people's property, do not destroy property, right? Do not unjustly kill. Okay? So it's important for us to stay balanced. Then Sheikh Amin, touched on what I think we can call aqidah-based therapy. Right? And Sheikh Amin, in many of his tafsīr, in many of his speeches, he speaks about a very, you can say, a very common, or he speaks about this very visible malady and disease that is in the ummah. Right? It's very apparent. It is the disease of self-hate. Okay. So it is the disease of self-hate, and the therapy that Sheikh Amin, based on the tafsir of what we are covering, he is prescribing, is saying that the enemy, that once a person feels, because let's take a step back, so you have hate, right, which is a human emotion, it needs to be directed towards, it needs an outlet. Okay. Currently, as we speak, the ummah's outlet of hate is towards itself. Okay. Now, how do you change that? You need to change the outlet. You can't change the human emotion or human instinct of hate. So when you direct the outlet of hate towards kufr and disbelievers, then the self-hating will immediately and automatically stop. Right? And the platform that Sheikh Amin builds on for this aqidah-based therapy is that people will say, well, the ummah is making so many mistakes and they're doing so many things wrong. There's the imams doing something wrong, the khatibs doing something wrong, the rulers of the Muslims are doing something wrong, Muslims themselves are doing so many things wrong. Okay, but based on our aqidah, are they Muslim or are they not Muslim? Do they say La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? If they do, then based off of our aqidah, they are eligible for the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we hope that Allah will forgive them. But the same cannot be said for a disbeliever. If the disbeliever passes away with disbelief, then they are not eligible for the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So which one should you direct hate towards? Right? So once you redirect the hate, then automatically what will happen is we will stop self-hating. Okay? So that was a very insightful, what we can call what he called social therapy, right? That social therapy was based on the aqidah that we hold. Right? Then he brought out another very important point in which he said that when we were talking about Ibrahim alayhi salam and the community of believers being a role model for us, there was the instance in the surah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made an exception. It said, Illa qawla Ibrahim. Okay? That what is not part of the model is when Ibrahim alayhi salam, he asked Allah to forgive his father after his father had passed away on disbelief. So the point that Sheikh Amin extracted from here, which is very insightful, is that our obedience is not because of the personality, it is because that personality conveys the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And whenever there's any personality that steps out of the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then we no longer owe any obedience or allegiance to that personality. Our obedience and our allegiance is to the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? That is not to say in any sense that takes in any form or shape that we are taking away from the status of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Okay? And this is just a principle that we're highlighting. Illa qawla Ibrahim. Okay. What we do see as a model is that after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informed Ibrahim alayhi salam that he is not to make istighfar, he is not to seek forgiveness for his father after he has passed away, we notice that Ibrahim alayhi salam, he submitted to the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? And over here we see that the uncle of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he did not believe, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had to come to terms with that. Ibrahim alayhi salam's father did not believe, he had to come to terms with that. The fathers of many of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they did not believe. They had to come to terms with that. So the principle we're seeing is of submission. You're submitting your emotions by coming to terms with the hukum of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with coming to terms with the order and the command and the decree and will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? And this again highlights that our coming together into groups, our grouping is based on our theology, not even family. Okay? And there is a very historical concept to this, because even when we read the seerah, okay, sometimes you can read the seerah through a PR lens, okay, through the lens of media. Okay? That imagine what was the type of PR and media onslaught that was going against the Muslims. The onslaught was, they are, for example, they said they are those, the Prophet ﷺ, they're saying he is the one who is rejecting our accepted social and family norms. He's the one that is splitting homes apart. He's a home wrecker. He's dividing sons from their fathers. He's dividing brothers. Okay? And this is not the Arab way. This is not what the Arabs do. We're all about the tribe. We stay together. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking to the Arab in their own language, in their own cultural norms, saying, look, as the Arab, you trace your lineage back to Ibrahim alayhi salam. So this concept of separating based on theology has a historical precedent in your Arab lineage. Then we came to the very insightful tafsir that Sheikh Amin did of رَبَّنَا لَا تَجْعَلْنَا فِتْنَةً لِلَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. Allah, do not make us a fitna, do not make us a test for those that disbelieve. Okay? Perhaps we can take just a couple minutes to discuss Sheikh Amin's tafsir. Usually, as he explained, this is interpreted as, don't let us be punished at the hands of the disbelievers, because that will corroborate their assumption that they are on the side of the right and they are on the side of the truth. And that is why God is assisting them against the Muslims. Right? A very human inclination. And that would become a test in the sense that it would dissuade them from becoming Muslims, because they would think, well, if the Muslims were on the truth, then they wouldn't be defeated. But in Arabic we have or in tafsir, in tafsir we have a principle, al-ibratu li'umum al-lafzi la li khusus al-sabab, that the principle or it's based on the generality of the word, not the specific interpretation. Okay? So the generality of the word fitna is in any sense that will become a test or dissuade someone from faith. Okay? Whether that comes in the form of Muslims being defeated, or it comes in the form of Muslims having un-Islamic behavior, or behavior that does not accurately represent what Islam is. And as a result, other non-Muslims that observe that would not want to become Muslim because of that. Okay? So this was the tafsir that Sheikh Amin, he adopted towards رَبَّنَا لَا تَجْعَلْنَا فِتْنَةً لِلَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. And in my humble opinion, it is a very good tafsir of how and there's definitely scope for that tafsir. Not that my opinion in front of his knowledge holds any value, but from the little that I have studied, it is a very valid way of doing the tafsir. And as you know, part of that not being a fitna or not being a test for the disbelievers is to not publicly announce and not to publicly air the faults of other Muslims. That is a That is something that we do within ourselves. We do not expose that to the outside community. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala build that unity within us and allow us to have that wahda. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, subhanakallah wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.